Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and you're listening to Unpacking Israeli History, the podcast that takes a deep dive into some of the most intense, historically fascinating, and often misunderstood events and stories linked to Israeli history. Before we start, I just wanted to remind you, email me. If you have questions, comments, ruminations, you know the drill. Noam@JewishUnpack.com. Okay, yalla, let's do this. I have a confession to make. I'm not a poetry guy. I said it. The closest I get is like something from Nathan Alterman or Chaim Nachman Bialik, or brilliant quotes from smart people like Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, of blessed memory. But I'm going to start off this episode by quoting part of a poem that most of us probably haven't thought about since we slogged through it in 10th grade. In his 1892 poem, Song of Myself, Walt Whitman asks, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. I contain multitudes. You contain multitudes. We contain multitudes." And that's a very, very important reminder as we close out our two-part series on Israeli settlers and settlements. Because you'll hear from some people you might not instinctively agree with, whose motivations are confusing or foreign to you. You don't need to accept or endorse anyone's actions or opinions. I'm inviting you, however, to listen with an open mind and remember we are all complicated. And we are all responding to the time and place and circumstances we have been given. If you haven't listened to part 1, go back and start there. I mean, you can start here, I guess, but you'll be missing a lot of important context. For those who listened to part 1 but are like, I've forgotten everything that happened more than 5 minutes ago, first of all, welcome to the club. And second of all, here's a very quick recap of everything we covered last week. You ready? Here we go. In 1967, Israel was facing down what seemed like a war of annihilation. Egypt had massed troops on the border. Syrian radio was promising war. Israelis were digging graves and cracking macabre jokes about their imminent deaths. Instead, Israel won the war that Egypt had promised, and far from being annihilated, the Jewish state quadrupled in size, now holding Gaza, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The mood in Israel was euphoric, and for the religious, it was further proof of a divine hand at work. For them, how could you not see it? But with that victory came very practical questions, like, what do we do with the territories we just acquired? And what about the 1.2 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza? What's the plan with them? And why is the UN telling us to return the land and make peace with our neighbors when our neighbors have announced that as far as they're concerned, we don't exist? No, seriously, in September of 1967, the Arab League adopted a resolution known informally as the 3 No's. Ready for them? Here they are. No peace with Israel. No recognition of Israel. No negotiation with Israel. 2 months later, the UN passed a resolution calling for peace. You gotta wonder what was going through their minds then. Israel never got a satisfactory answer to its third question. But as for the first 2, the Israeli government answered in stages. For the Israelis, keeping the eastern part of Jerusalem, or East Jerusalem, was a no-brainer, for reasons that we've explored in other episodes, as always, link in the show notes. And keeping the Golan Heights was very, very, very attractive. For religiously and historically inclined Israelis, the Golan Heights was part and parcel of the Promised Land, a documented region of biblical Israel assigned to the tribe of Menachem. In the Torah, it's known as Bashan, and the historical resonance was hard to miss. The Golan was the scene of multiple battles waged by Jewish rebels, from the Maccabees to the anti-Roman rebels of the Second Temple period. Until the 700s CE, the Golan was quite Jewish territory. But there were practical considerations too, really important ones. The Golan is a mountainous region, which made it strategically valuable. It's much easier to defend territory from highlands than from lowlands, and defense was top of mind for most Israelis. Israelis in the north of the country were tired of acting as target practice for the Syrians next door, who used their strategic high ground to terrorize the communities at the base of the Golan's plateau. Right? So the government allowed and even incentivized small communities of Jews to spread throughout the north. The more Israeli the Golan became, the less likely Israel would be able to return it. Also, low-key, ever go to the Golan in a game of underrated versus overrated? It would absolutely be underrated. Such a gorgeous and serene place when it isn't a battlefield, that is. And what about the West Bank / Judea and Samaria, and also Gaza, and also the Sinai? Much of that land was extremely important from a strategic standpoint. But to understand why, you have to understand the region's geography. If you look at a map of Israel, you'll see that most of the country's population is concentrated in the coastal plain, partially ringed by the north-south mountain ridges of the West Bank. As we explained with the Golan, it's a lot easier to mount a defense from the high ground. Whoever controls the West Bank's mountains has a pretty good shot at either devastating or defending major Israeli population centers, not to mention most of the country's industry and infrastructure. Plus, roughly 1/3 of the country's water comes from the underground aquifers underneath the West Bank's low mountains. And in a water-poor region, that is significant. Not to mention the West Bank held particular emotional resonance for the Jewish people, like so much. This was the site of some of Judaism's most important moments. This was where Jacob dreamed of a ladder that stretched to the heavens, where our forefathers and foremothers were buried, where Joshua made the walls of Jericho fall down, and where he was eventually laid to rest. This was where the Holy Tabernacle lay for hundreds of years, where King David first built his capital before he moved it to Jerusalem. This was where Bar Kokhba made his doomed last stand. This was historic and holy ground for Jews, the most. And yet for the first decade after the Six-Day War, it was largely ignored. The Israeli government greenlit a couple of Jewish communities there like Kfar Etzion, which had been destroyed in 1948 by the Arabs. In the immediate years after 1967, some zealous Jews had established outposts there, while the Israeli government looked the other way. But that doesn't mean the government wasn't planning for possible eventualities. Just a month after the end of the war, Labor Minister Yigal Allon presented a plan to Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, which hinged on the following premises. And listen to them, they're really important. Number one, it's possible to make peace with the entire Arab world, including the Palestinians, without sacrificing Israeli security. Two, any plan moving forward would have to protect Israel as a Jewish majority democratic state, meaning that any peace plan hinged on there being two separate states. And number three, Palestinians deserved a state, whether it was part of Jordan or its own thing, as long as it didn't compromise Israeli security. And when that state came, the Israelis were open to establishing a diplomatic relationship. As always, check out the show notes for the bibliography to see the sources. It's good to see primary sources every now and then. Check them out. I want to put a caveat in right here, though. If you Google the so-called Allon plan, you'll find a lot of unflattering assumptions. The part about maintaining a Jewish majority is often held up as an example of how awful and racist Israelis are. As far as I'm concerned, every nation has the right to establish and maintain its own national character based on its national values. Israel was established as the only Jewish state in the world, and I see absolutely no issue with wanting to maintain a majority Jewish democracy. But we'll talk about that in another episode in 2025. Back to the Allon plan. Allon proposed that Israel would cede much of the West Bank to Jordan, with the exception of a few strategic areas. To start, Israel would annex all of Jerusalem, full stop, as well as a 15-kilometer wide portion of the Jordan Valley from the Mahola Junction just above Jericho, maintaining strategically, religiously, and historically significant communities. They would also annex a 25-kilometer wide stretch of the Judean desert from Mitzpeh Yericho down past Susia, which includes the communities of Tekoa, Ma'ale Adumim, and Kiryat Arba. An Israeli-controlled and presumably highly fortified road would link the two regions. The Jordanians would get the rest of the West Bank, including major population centers like Ramallah, Tulkarem, Bethlehem, and Hebron, linked by a Jordanian-controlled road. Israel would negotiate with the Arab states and the Palestinians to figure out what to do with the Arab-majority towns in annexed Jewish areas. And a road would be built to easily ferry Jews and Arabs between the West Bank and Gaza. And if you're like, hey, wait a sec, I'm not hearing anything about a Palestinian state, well, that would be for Jordan to work out with the Palestinians. It should be said that most Israeli officials favored an independent Palestinian state at the time over the so-called Jordanian option, based in part on the fact that they had very, very little trust in the Jordanian king. If you've listened to our Six-Day War episodes, you will understand why. But the plan was never actually implemented. Never happened. During negotiations, Palestinian leaders informed Eshkol he would need the approval of the rest of the Arab world. The Jordanians said the same. And so the plan languished, and the problem of settlements and military presence and occupation of people and lack of Palestinian autonomy persists to this very day. In the meantime, some Israelis were making their own plans. By 1974, a growing number of religious Zionists coalesced into a group that would officially become known as Gush Emunim, or the Bloc of the Faithful, whose motto is the land of Israel for the people of Israel according to the Torah of Israel. But it wasn't until 1977 that the so-called settlement movement really took off. And that is where today's story starts, with the historic election of 1977, which upended Israeli politics forever. Part 3, the green light. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you already know that if there's ever a contest for the position of president of the Menachem Begin fan club, well, I will win. No, he was not perfect. See, my heroes don't have to be perfect. I'm cool with that. And no, I don't agree with everything he said and did, but still, fascinating guy. If you started listening today and are like, who's Menachem Begin? First of all, hi, bold of you to start on part 2 of a 2-part series. That's so interesting. That's really chaotic energy right there. One day, I would love to do a full episode about Begin's story, which we've so far told only in bits and pieces. But until then, here's what you need to know about him for the purpose of this episode. 1, he was the first right-wing Israeli prime minister to unseat the lefty establishment that had ruled Israel since day one. 2, as a co-founder of the Likud party, he's remembered as a hardliner, but he was also the first Israeli prime minister to ink a peace deal with an Arab leader. And 3, unlike prior leaders, Begin was cool with settlements and with the Gush Emunim settler movement. Here he is giving a speech to the Orthodox Jews of Elon Moreh, which was, at the time, an unrecognized outpost. Nerd Corner alert. Fittingly, Elon Moreh was named after the biblical location where God promised Abraham that Israel would belong to his descendants forever. In the near future, there will be many settlements like Elon Moreh. So Begin appointed Ariel Sharon as Minister of Agriculture and Settlement Czar. You may remember Sharon from other episodes of Unpacking Israeli History, of course, link in the show notes. Unlike Begin, Sharon did not have the same appreciation for religious Judaism. But he had another reason for promoting settlements throughout the West Bank. The settlements will prevent any territorial compromise. Prevent territorial compromise is a pretty anodyne way of saying, well, I'll let Shaul Arieli, an Israeli political scientist and researcher, explain it. Sharon's plan was to create the containment process by building the Western Security Zone along the Green Line in order to seize the hills overlooking the coastal plain. That's where he focused the settlement efforts. But because of the cooperation with the Gush Emunim movement, they extended the settlement enterprise into the mountain ridge. The objective was to bisect the West Bank, disturb the continuity of the Arab settlements, and prevent the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. Now, this is a little hard to hear, right? According to Arieli, their objective was to disturb the continuity of Arab settlements and prevent the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. I mean, why? Why do that? Why would you prevent a Palestinian state? Well, before you make your mind up, I'd like to remind you that this is 1978. And back in 1978, Palestinian leaders like Yasser Arafat were busy planning events like this one. My first memory is of a loud noise. Mom was wounded. Everyone started yelling. I remember the words hunters, hunters. As children, we were in a state of shock. Noise, the sound of gunfire. There were screams because some on the bus were already wounded. The driver and my mom were wounded in the first volley of bullets. Eran Boshkenitz was a kid when 11 Fatah terrorists infiltrated Israel from South Lebanon. First, they murdered an American tourist on the beach. Then they hijacked a taxi, killing everyone inside it. And then they hijacked a chartered bus full of families. They sprayed the passengers with bullets and tossed grenades out the windows at passing cars. By the time Israeli forces managed to stop them, 38 civilians had been murdered, including 13 children. And let me just be clear, because I know that sometimes all the different parties can get confusing. The people who did this were associated not with Hamas, with Fatah, the party of Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas. Granted, Hamas did not exist at the time. But you know what? Today, much of the world views Fatah as moderates. But back then, Arafat and his party were considered out-and-out terrorists, the kind Israel vowed they would never talk to. Say what you want about Sharon and about Begin and about settlements in general. But it's hard to not discount the fact that when Israel looked at Palestinian leadership, the representatives of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause, this is what they saw. So when you ask yourself, why would Sharon want to prevent the formation of a Palestinian state in the late 70s? Well, attacks like this were a big part of the reason. So under Begin and Sharon, West Bank settlements expanded. And it wasn't just the West Bank. In 1981, the state officially annexed the Golan Heights in East Jerusalem 13 years after winning those areas from Syria and Jordan. But Begin, he was a complex man. He was a man who contained multitudes. It was under his watch that Israel uprooted a settlement too. By the way, More than 2 decades later, Ariel Sharon would also uproot a block of Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip. But we'll get there. Here's how I introduced this surprising turn of events all the way back in season 4. 7 years into his tenure as head of state, President Sadat addresses the Egyptian parliament. And among the bluster, the promises that, quote, "There is no power on earth that can stop me from demanding total Israeli withdrawal from occupied Arab lands and the recovery of the Palestinians' rights." Sadat went off book. He says something extemporaneous from the heart. Here it is, quote, "I am ready to go to the end of the world if this would prevent the wounding, let alone the killing of a soldier or an officer of my boys. Israel will be surprised when it hears me say that I won't refuse to go to their own home, to the Knesset itself, to discuss peace." And in Jerusalem, Menachem Begin was listening. And when a reporter asked what he thought of Sadat's offer, Begin responded, "If President Sadat really means it, then Ahlan wa Sahlan, Arabic for welcome." 2 days later, Begin addressed the Egyptians via radio broadcast. In ancient times, Egypt and Eretz Israel were allies against a common enemy from the north. Indeed, many changes have taken place since those days, but perhaps the intrinsic basis for friendship and mutual help remains unaltered. We, the Israelis, stretch out our hand to you. No more wars. Peace, a real peace, and forever. Less than a week later, Sadat was on a plane to Israel. It took a while to hammer out the details, but Egypt and Israel finally signed a peace treaty in 1979. But peace came with compromises, like returning the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. There were 16 Israeli communities in the Sinai, including the town of Ophira, right on the coast of the Red Sea, and the settlement of Yamit. Today, Ophira is better known by its Arabic name, Sharm el-Sheikh, though Egypt's tourism authority website neglects to mention that this gorgeous resort town was actually built and handed over intact by Israel. By the way, I totally wasted 20 minutes dreaming about learning to scuba dive. I'm actually afraid of deep sea water, but I still dreamt about it. It wasn't a nightmare, it was a dream, so that I could go diving in Sharm el-Sheikh. Yamit was the biggest of Israel's settlements in the Sinai, though that's not saying much. There were only 600 houses in the whole town. It should have been relatively easy to evacuate, but the residents of Yamit weren't interested in leaving. Some even threatened to blow themselves up if the IDF entered their homes. Thankfully, that did not happen. When push came to shove, you know what? Neither the IDF soldiers nor the Yamit settlers were ready to actually hurt one another. Jews would not come against Jews to fight each other. Wouldn't happen. The evacuation worked. Ever since Sadat and Begin signed the peace treaty of 79, Egypt and Israel have had a peace, a cold peace, but a peace. Evacuating the Sinai communities seemed a small price to pay for peace with a formidable enemy. Was land for peace the winning formula that would finally end the Arab-Israeli conflict? Short answer, no. In fact, as the 80s dragged on, the conflict seemed more intractable than ever. As you know from past episodes, link in the show notes of course, as 1987 bled into 1988, the first Intifada plunged Israelis and Palestinians alike into half a decade of violence. But even as the Israeli army cracked down, Israeli citizens were building new settlements just a hop, skip, and a jump away from Palestinian cities seething with violence. Not that you know it from looking at their communities. In 2016, the journalist Johnny Harris visited multiple Israeli settlements across the West Bank. Low-key, our Unpacked YouTube team, shout out to them, the best YouTube team in the world, learned a lot from the production of Johnny Harris. Anyway, here's how he described them.
Okay, and then Murphy carried them to the playoffs.
Spend 10 minutes in a settlement today, and you sometimes feel that you could just as easily be in a New Jersey suburb. Clean roads, big houses, quality parks, good schools, close-by shopping, a university. You ask people why they moved out here, and instead of the original mission to push forward the Israeli state, you hear things like
a very good educational system.
So there's a very nice country club.
We wanted to be able to have a bigger place.
It's a great place to raise kids.
It's just a beautiful view, and it's our beautiful land, and I love looking at it all the time.
We were looking for a Jerusalem suburb that we could afford, that was a manageable commute.
Close to Jerusalem, extremely close to Jerusalem.
The quality of life is so much better. It has nothing to do with politics.
Having a little bit more quiet.
Sounds surprising, I know. But the Israelis who live in the West Bank are just people. They want the same things that most people want. A good quality of life. So in the early 1990s, when it came out that the Israeli government was secretly talking to the PLO about a potential peace deal, many Israelis were absolutely outraged. Which brings us to Part 4, War and Peace. Here's how I described the Oslo Accords a few seasons ago. And yes, link in the show notes. the Accords established that there would be a democratically elected Palestinian interim self-government authority that would rule the West Bank and Gaza. This interim period was supposed to last 5 years, at which point there would be a more permanent, democratically elected government. So to ensure a smooth transition into self-determination, the Accords mandated that the Palestinian interim government would establish all kinds of entities to deal with infrastructure. It's amazing how incredibly mundane the business of government is when you get down to it. Someone has to make sure the lights stay on and the sewage stays out of the street. Finally, to ensure this government actually had land to rule, Israel would withdraw from the Gaza Strip and parts of the West Bank, starting with the ancient city of Jericho. Listen closely. There's not a word in there about freezing settlement construction. Yes, Israel would withdraw from some Palestinian territories, but according to the U.S. State Department, this withdrawal applied only to the military. Israeli settlements would be left intact, although Prime Minister Rabin did make plans to discourage settlers from moving into the West Bank, like a freeze on the paving of roads throughout the West Bank. Such moves left Israeli settlers seething. They remembered the dismantling of Yamit. They had no desire to be ripped from their homes in the name of a peace they didn't even believe would come. There's no way. How can you trust the PLO? Because as Rabin was moving ahead with his plans, Hamas, now part of the story, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad were sending suicide bombers into Israeli cities. At a closed-door sermon at a mosque in Johannesburg, Arafat did the thing that everyone wished he never would. He did the thing. He did doublespeak. He called for Muslims to liberate Jerusalem through jihad. Okay? Rabin wasn't trying to win over the settlement movement, but he really put his foot in his mouth in early 1995 when he responded to a terror attack by saying, quote, "We don't want the majority of the Jewish population, of whom 98% live within sovereign Israel, to be vulnerable to terrorism," which to many settlers, here from their perspective, sounded a whole lot like, "Screw you, I don't care if you get killed." Even if that's not what he meant. Even as some Israelis were thronging to the streets to sing songs of peace, tens of thousands of counter-protesters were mobilizing, hoisting signs with Rabin dressed as a Nazi. One of those counter-protesters was none other than Yigal Amir. And in November of 1995, Yigal Amir did what some extremists on the extreme right vowed to do. They're chanting, "With blood, with fire, we will expel Rabin." But chants are one thing and murder is a totally different thing. And despite the division that roiled the Jewish state, despite the anger of citizens who felt like Rabin was selling them out, despite the fervent protests, the country went into shock when Yigal Amir killed their prime minister with 3 shots to the back as he exited a peace rally. For years after Rabin's funeral, Jews all over the world would slap bumper stickers on their cars with the final 2 words of President Bill Clinton's remarks after the assassination.
Because words cannot express my true feelings, let me just say, Shalom, Haver. Goodbye, friend.
Despite the shock, despite the grief, and despite the rash of terror attacks that followed Rabin's assassination, the peace process limped on. In the summer of 2000, Prime Minister Ehud Barak and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat met at Camp David, the U.S. president's country retreat tucked away in the wooded hills of Maryland. Shout out to my home state. Barak offered the Palestinians over 90% of the West Bank and 100% of the Gaza Strip, but Yasser Arafat said no. And to be fair, that is just the Cliff Notes or Spark Notes version, depending on if you are Gen X or millennial listeners. And if you're Gen Z, then it's just, ChatGPT. As if to hammer home the point, the Palestinians then launched another intifada, this one much bloodier than the first. Again, I know I'm a broken record, but link to our episode about the Second Intifada in the show notes, more context and history there. So it might seem strange that at the very end of the Second Intifada, which resulted in the deaths of more than 1,000 Israelis and 4,000 Palestinians, the Israeli government decided to pull all Israeli citizens out of the Gaza Strip. And it might seem even stranger that the prime minister in charge of this initiative was the guy who had encouraged Israelis to build settlements in the first place, Menachem Begin's settlement czar, Ariel Sharon. Nerd corner alert, Sharon had earned the nickname the Bulldozer for sending construction crews all over the West Bank to build new communities in the 80s. But the name wasn't without affection. A bulldozer is a blunt and lethal instrument. but it also gets stuff done. Anyway, we have a whole episode about the Gaza disengagement, as it's known, so make sure to check it all out there. And we talk all about it in our October 7th series as well, so check it all out there. Yes, link in the show notes. So if you want to understand why Sharon made this decision, or how Israelis reacted to the pullout, check out those episodes. But for the purpose of this episode, what you need to know is that the so-called Gaza disengagement left a significant segment of Israeli society deeply scarred. Their army had uprooted them from their homes, kicking and screaming. 2 years later, Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, and yet somehow the Israelis kept negotiating. In 2008, Prime Minister Ehud Olmert offered PA President Mahmoud Abbas 94% of the West Bank. He would make up for the 6% that would remain in Israeli hands with a land swap. So almost like a 1-for-1 over here. And he would ensure the future Palestinian state would be contiguous, i.e. that it would encompass both the West Bank and Gaza. Israel would annex major settlement blocks, including the Etzion block, but uproot the rest. Jerusalem's old city and its holy sites would be placed under international control, and Israel would absorb a small number of Palestinians or their descendants who had been displaced in 1948. Israel would compensate the rest. There would be no more settlements, no more occupation, quote unquote, no more disputed territory, quote unquote, just two states side by side. Sounds good. Abbas said no, claiming he was not allowed to study the maps, whatever that means. Plus, he wanted Israel to absorb the millions of so-called refugees descended from the original 700,000 Palestinians who left or were expelled in 1948, essentially asking for Israel to stop being a Jewish state. So he walked away, and the two sides have been at a stalemate ever since. Meanwhile, settlements continue to spring up all over the West Bank. Today, nearly 500,000 Israelis live in West Bank settlements, cheek by jowl with roughly 3 million Palestinians, which brings us to Part 5, Strange Bedfellows. Okay, I love this. Tekoa is an unusual place. It's one of the settlements that makes up the Gush Etzion block, somewhere between Jerusalem and Hebron, check out your maps to figure this out, with a reputation for being artsy, hippie-ish, a chill mix of the very religious and the entirely secular. Much of that reputation is due to the influence of a fascinating, one-of-a-kind, sui generis rabbi named Menachem Froman. Rabbi Froman was one of the founding members of the Gush Emoni movement and Tekoa's chief rabbi. Like other religious Zionists, Froman believed that God had given Israel to the Jewish people as a divine inheritance. And he believed that, well, because the Hebrew Bible says it time and time again.
We haven't come to Tekoa as a part of the occupation. I came to Tekoa because I'm connected to this land. Yes, I didn't come in order to be an obstacle to the Palestinian state. We come back home.
Froman was extremely opposed to the 2005 Gaza disengagement and spent much of the summer of 2005 in the Gaza Strip to show his support for its soon-to-be evicted Jewish residents. So far, you might be thinking, okay, this is what I expected from a settlement rabbi. Okay, here it is. But unlike many other leaders of the settler movement, Froman nurtured close ties to anyone who was willing to talk to him. Sounds pretty cool in the 21st century, including figures like Yasser Arafat and even Ahmed Yassin, the spiritual leader of Hamas. Here he's describing his charmingly bizarre, or perhaps bizarrely charming, relationship to Yasser Arafat.
Why he invited me again and again, and even in his last days, he phoned here to this telephone and say to me, El Chacham Froman, or as we were, Arafat has an excellent sense of humor. Perhaps you, the Palestinians, don't have the same impression, but he was a joker. But he used to call me Sheikh Froman, and I called him El Chacham Abu Amar. Yes, so he said to me, Sheikh Froman I'm coming back to the telephone, came to me as soon as possible. I said, Ya Rais, why? Come to me. And then I understood that he's ill. And he wanted to depart for me. But he knows that I'm a settler. Not only he knows. The reason that he was so interested with the connections with me, because I am a settler.
Listen, I've heard Arafat called a lot of things, but El Chacham Abu Amar is a new one. Chacham, by the way, is another word for rabbi. It literally means scholar. This kind of conversation is exactly why Rabbi Froman's obituary in the New York Times called him startlingly unconventional and included juicy little tidbits like this, quote, in February 2008, Rabbi Froman worked with Khaled Amira, a Palestinian journalist close to Hamas, to forge a peace agreement that would have released an imprisoned Israeli soldier, lifted economic sanctions on the Gaza Strip, which is controlled by Hamas, and imposed a ceasefire there. Hamas leaders accepted the deal, but Israel ignored it. Again, people contain multitudes. Rabbi Froman passed away in 2013, 3 years before a Palestinian teenager stabbed his daughter, Michal, who was 4 months pregnant at the time, yards away from her home in Tekoa. I asked God why he stabbed me. It was like, it felt as if it was meant to be me. I felt very strongly that it was aimed at me, and there was a message here for me. Obviously, yes, I'm a person of faith, but it was also very obvious. I just felt it. I had no hatred. I had this sorrow that we live in fear in our community, and that young boys like this can just venture out with a knife. I just felt sorrow for both realities, and I believe that no one is to blame. The people of Israel have only the land of Israel. History brought the Palestinians here, and they're here. No one is to blame. This is the reality. Let's do the best we can. We have to explain this to the other side as well. That, quote, other side came to visit in the wake of the stabbing. 2 delegations coming to formally apologize. The meeting ended with the recitation of the Muslim prayers right in Michal's living room, an experience she described as amazing. Does that surprise you? A Palestinian stabs a settler, and his town sends 2 delegations to apologize? It surprised me when I first learned about it. It's okay if it surprises you. That's not in line with the kind of thing we hear in the media about settlers. That's not in line with the media coverage of the West Bank, of Judea and Samaria. And neither is the fact that 33 settlements are home to Arab residents too. Now, I will be the first to say this is rare. The Israeli government officially recognizes 132 settlements in the West Bank, plus an estimated 20,000 Israelis live in unrecognized outposts that the government considers illegal. So 33 settlements out of 132 isn't exactly the majority, and the number in each community varies, but still, that's interesting. A quarter of the settlements have Palestinian residents. Close to 600 Palestinians live in the Jewish settlement of Ariel, so they can attend the college there. Listen, I'm not trying to sound haughty, but I consider myself pretty knowledgeable about Israel. I do host a podcast about it and everything, and until this episode and the research, I didn't know that any settlements are home to Arabs. I'm embarrassed, I'm sorry, but you know what? I'm vulnerable and honest with you, but when it comes to Israel, things are always more complicated than they initially appear. Okay, back to Tekoa, where many of Michal's neighbors share her sorrow. They want to live on ancient Jewish land. It's Jewish land. They're Jewish, and it's Jewish land, okay? And they also want Palestinians to have basic human rights. People contain multitudes. It's important to me to live in a Jewish country. It is. When I plow my fields and find a clay pot, it takes me to places that I love. I feel I'm in the land of the Jews. And 2,500 years ago, there were Jews here who plowed the land that I'm plowing. I'm not exaggerating. On the other hand, there are many Arabs here. They're human beings too. Everyone has rights. They should have rights too. How do we integrate all this with the fact that there's a bloody conflict and people are being killed? It's not easy. When you look around, it's heartbreaking. But is there a contradiction here? After all, critics of the settler movement say that settlers are the reason that Palestinians in the West Bank don't have all the rights they deserve. They say that the settlements are the barrier to peace. They say that the settlements are nothing more than a land grab, designed to steal land earmarked for a Palestinian state. But even many people who are ideologically opposed to settlements take issue with this argument. They say, if the Palestinians wanted a state, they would have accepted the terms that Israel offered multiple times. If they wanted a state, they wouldn't commit murders so brutal that podcast hosts have to warn their listeners to skip ahead to avoid graphic descriptions of violence. Kobi Mandel lived in Tekoa. I don't know if he had any personal feelings about Arabs and Israelis or a two-state solution or Palestinian autonomy. Most 13-year-olds don't think about stuff like that. Most 13-year-olds aren't murdered over stuff like that.
15 years ago, my son, Kobi, who was a 13-year-old boy who grew up in America, went for a hike with his friend Yosef Ishran near our home in Tekoa. They cut school. They walked around the outside of our community, down a long dirt path, and proceeded to do what they thought would be to spend the day exploring this beautiful canyon. 10 o'clock in the morning, the two boys were trapped in a small cave by 4 or 5 Palestinian terrorists and beaten to death with boulders the size of bowling balls. It was a very brutal crime.
The terrorists who murdered Kobi and Yosef mutilated their bodies so badly that Israeli authorities had to use dental records to identify them. The killers were never found. Their murder came 7 weeks after a Palestinian sniper shot 10-month-old Shalhevet Pass in the city of Hebron, meaning the sniper targeted her. And a few days after an Israeli tank shell killed 4-month-old Iman Hiju in Gaza. Since 2008, over 160 Israelis have died in the West Bank as a result of Palestinian terror attacks. Hundreds more have been grievously wounded. Some of the attacks, like the one on Kobi and Yosef, have been particularly chilling. Take the story of the Fogel family, murdered in the settlement of Itamar in March of 2011. I won't describe it in detail because, frankly, I cannot. Just know that in a matter of minutes, 2 teenage Palestinians brutally slaughtered 5 members of the same family. Mom, dad, and 3 kids, aged 11, 4, and 3 months. The bodies were eventually discovered by 12-year-old Tamar Fogel, who had been out at a youth meeting. She came home to find her 2-year-old brother desperately trying to wake up their parents. It's heartbreaking. Even now, almost 14 years later, I can barely say those words. It's impossible, but if the murderers were hoping to drive the settlers away, they failed completely. Rabbi Yaakov Cohen was the first adult on the scene. His testimony is horrifying, and yet he says the murders had a surprising effect on the community. It sounds weird, but the murders had a positive effect. The settlement got stronger in terms of population and construction. All the parameters of normal life have improved since the incident. And it wasn't just the settlement of Itamar. In the wake of the massacre, the Israeli government approved the construction of hundreds of new housing units in the highly populated settlement blocks of Gush Etzion, Ma'ale Adumim, Ariel, and Modi'in Ilit. All areas that Israel plans to hang on to in the event of a peace deal with the Palestinians, though the prospect of any deal has been vanishingly slim. As Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said, quote, "They shoot and we build." It's been nearly 14 years since the massacre, and Israeli support for settlements has only grown. A 2024 Pew survey found that 49% of Israeli Jews believe that settlements help Israeli security. In fact, the report goes on to say, quote, "Among the Israeli public overall, the view that settlements enhance security has increased 13 points since we first asked this question in 2013. Over that same 11-year period, the share of Israeli Jews who think building settlements helps Israel's security has steadily grown." But why? How? How do you look at a massacre of 5 innocent people and think, yep, these communities make us feel safer? Well, for some, it comes down to simple geography. Remember, before 1967, Israel was only 9 miles wide at its narrowest point, a situation that Abba Eban, just this unbelievable speaker, you got to check him out, he once described memorably these borders as what he called Auschwitz borders. Okay? Strong language. The West Bank expands Israel's borders, making the country overall more defensible, but it goes way beyond mere geography. Israel devotes a lot of resources towards keeping settlement communities safe. The IDF has a significant presence in the West Bank. The more Israeli civilians live in the West Bank, the more deeply rooted the IDF becomes. And that has very practical consequences for Israeli security. After Israel left Gaza in 2005, the Strip became a hotbed of Hamas terror. Do I need to tell you what Hamas has done? For nearly a decade, Hamas's rockets terrorized the border communities of Israel's south. By 2014, those rockets were able to reach central Israel with its major population centers. So Israel went to war, entering Gaza and losing 66 soldiers in the process. It's a big deal. In contrast, Hamas has never been able to fire a single rocket from the West Bank despite their active presence there, simply because the army can keep them in check. You get it? So that's the security argument for the settlements. But there's another, much more immediate argument for living in a settlement. And it's simple economics. Property is crazy expensive in Israel. People want to live there. And though the West Bank isn't cheap per se, it's certainly cheaper. Sometimes that's all it comes down to. Bang for buck. This is Talia. She lives in the West Bank community of Peduel, whose official website bills it as a settlement with a soul.
About a year ago, we decided to move to Peduel in order to make a change in our lives. We opened a new business. We have a little pastry shop. The reason we moved here is because financially we couldn't manage with the life in Tel Aviv or the Sharon or whatever.
Another settler we spoke to, who asked to remain nameless for personal reasons, told us, quote, "I would say that 95% of settlers have not moved to this area, myself included, as ideology. I moved to my house because it's beautiful and large and spacious and costs about like a quarter of what the rest of the country costs. That's why I moved here. I'm 20 minutes outside of Jerusalem and it's beautiful. And that was all the calculation I made." So yeah, I mean, pretty reasonable, I think. But why is the West Bank more affordable? Because it's extremely heavily subsidized by the Israeli government. In 2023 alone, the government devoted 25% of its transportation budget to building or improving roads in the West Bank, even though just 5% of Israel's population lives there. These subsidies create huge incentives for Israelis to move to West Bank communities. We're talking about towns 20 minutes from Jerusalem or Tel Aviv with affordable housing, well-funded schools, and tight-knit communities. And according to Raja Shadeh, the Ramallah-born founder of Palestinian human rights organization Al-Haq, settlers can easily keep their distance from the Palestinians they live beside.
This is the Palestinian city of Beit Jala, and the idea of this very expensive 2 tunnels and bridge is to shorten the distance for these settlers and make it possible for them to reach their settlements and Jerusalem in a matter of 8 minutes. It allows the Israelis to pretend that they have never left Israel, although they have left Israel of 67 and gone to their illegal settlements on the Palestinian side. They are able to move from these 2 places, from Israel to the West Bank, without feeling that they have moved away from sovereign Israel.
I don't know if you heard it, but I hear the frustration in his voice. I hear it. I understand it. In his eyes, listen, from his perspective, that's what we like to do, right? The settlements do not belong to Israel. He believes Jews in the West Bank are living on stolen land. That's how he sees it. And so the bridges and roads that allow them to zip between mainland Israel and their homes simply perpetuate the ugly myth that there is no one else on this land, that they can live separately and well without ever looking their neighbors in the eyes. And whether or not you agree that settlements are built on stolen land, whether or not you think Raja Shadeh is characterizing settlers fairly, one thing seems to be unquestionably true. Settlers and the Palestinians they live next to rarely interact meaningfully with one another. We mentioned the handful of Palestinians who live inside settlements, as well as the occasional delegation that comes to visit in the wake of tragedy. And some Palestinians have permits to work in the settlements, often in construction or other blue-collar jobs. But opportunities for real interactions, let alone friendships, are vanishingly rare. Here's our unnamed settler again explaining why. "I was offered a lot of money by somebody to build any project that would have my town and Palestinians work together. I could not get interest on either side. And that was way before October 7th. Let's say we create a soccer after-school program. The amount of security you would need to get me to send my kid there would be beyond belief. And that means that most interactions between Palestinians and settlers are incidental. Passing by in a shared supermarket, driving on the same road, enjoying the same playgrounds. That's 2 groups existing in the same space, in the same place. It's not a relationship. Which means that many of the interactions between Palestinians and settlers are just violent ones. We've talked already about some of the atrocities committed against settlers, but as hard as it is to admit it, the horror flows in both directions. I'm not equating the two, just describing. There's a small but violent fringe contingent of the settler movement that menaces Palestinian villages. Part 6 on the Hilltops. One of the fascinating aspects of Israeli society is that often you can meet people from Tel Aviv or Haifa or even Jerusalem who have never been to a settlement, never been there. They never met a certain kind of settler that you hear about in the news. And for me, I was beyond fascinated to learn a bit more about this reality and also one specific group of people. They are known as the Hilltop youth. They have this really special kind of Zionism, though. It's different. An attachment to this land, a commitment to a Jewish presence in ancient Jewish land that is just different. I'll be the first to say I don't understand the Hilltop youth. I've sought them out in their own homes, venturing deep into Judea and Samaria, deep into the West Bank, into Chavat Gilad, for instance. I wanted us to get to know them, to hear them describe themselves in their own words. I don't want other people to describe them. I wanted to hear. But when they did, I still didn't really understand them fully. They seem like mavericks, ungovernable, headstrong, with absolutely no interest in what other people think about them, including their fellow Jews. The Hilltop Youth, in Hebrew, Na'ar HaGvaot, is a loose coalition of young extremists who have latched onto a messianic anarchism, which they've followed to its most violent conclusion at times. They believe what the Hebrew Bible says, that Judea and Samaria is part of the land of Israel, which belongs to the people of Israel. And they're willing to fight anyone who disagrees, including Palestinians, the IDF, the Israeli government, and what some people call leftists. They took their name from a 1998 radio broadcast delivered by then Foreign Minister Ariel Sharon. There he is again. As Netanyahu and Arafat were haggling over a peace deal, Sharon urged Israelis to, quote, grab the hilltops and stake your claim. Everything we don't grab will go to them. Again, ironic that he ended up dismantling the settlements in Gaza just a few years later. Did I mention that people contain multitudes? Okay, anyway, so these young people stake a tent or a trailer on a random West Bank hilltop and just live there. The Israeli human rights NGO B'Tselem reports that the IDF doesn't stop settlers from erecting new structures for what are effectively illegal settlements. In some cases, the soldiers will even help the settlers with construction, according to them. But other outposts have very little in the way of quote-unquote construction. These are people living in a tent with no water, no electricity, and no real protection from the elements or the people who live nearby. And there are many, many clashes with the Palestinians who live nearby. Some start with Palestinians who throw rocks or stab or shoot any settler they see. Others start with the Hilltop Youth themselves, who sneak into Palestinian villages to set fire to mosques, destroy crops, and steal livestock. And sometimes things are even worse. In June 2015, Palestinian terrorists hiding on the side of the road opened fire on 4 Israeli civilians in the northern West Bank, murdering 26-year-old Malachi Rosenfeld as he and his friends returned from a basketball game. And then a few weeks later, a small group of Hilltop Youth took their revenge. Before dawn one Friday morning, they crept into the Palestinian village of Duma near Nablus, aka Shechem, and graffitied the words revenge and long live the Messiah on 2 homes. Then they smashed the windows and threw firebombs inside. One of the homes was empty at the time. The other wasn't. The Dawabsha family was sleeping inside. 35-year-old father Saad, 27-year-old mother Raham, 4-year-old Ahmed, and 18-month-old Ali. Please skip ahead by 30 seconds if you're sensitive. Saad managed to pull Raham and Ahmed out of their burning home, but in the darkness and confusion, baby Ali burned to death before his father could rescue him. Tragically, both Saad and Raham died of their wounds days later. Only 4-year-old Ahmed survived with burns on 60% of his body. Ahmed is 13 years old now, a heavily scarred orphan with few memories of the fire that stole his parents and baby brother. I saw the flames. I don't remember much. I only remember the TV melting on me. Someone named Ayad went inside and carried me out. That's all I remember. The 21-year-old who murdered Ahmed's parents sits in solitary confinement in Israeli prison. Israel takes this seriously, serving 3 life sentences plus 20 years. And for those who think the Israeli government merely backs anything the settlers do, it's not true. It's not true. The Israeli Supreme Court has rejected his appeals, writing, quote, "No words will reflect the magnitude of the horror. These actions contradict and conflict with all moral values and Jewish culture, which teaches patience and tolerance. Hatred of members of other religions, as well as racism for its own sake, is not a path of Judaism." For much of Israeli society, the Hilltop Youth are a menace, a tragic example of what happens to at-risk youth who run away from home to live on isolated hilltops. Our unnamed settler told me it's a mental health issue. You want to solve this problem? Inundate the hilltops with therapists. Okay. Another settler told Corey Gill Schuster, quote, "In my opinion, it doesn't matter what religion. You threw stones, it doesn't matter where you're from, you're a terrorist." But the Hilltop Youth don't see themselves as crazy or as terrorists. They see themselves as pioneers. Here's one young man explaining his philosophy. "We are sick of being stuck in ghettos, in settlements, surrounded by walls, unable to leave. We venture out in the wild, open spaces. We go where we want, where Jews haven't set foot for years, if not decades or centuries." Speaking personally here, it's tough to make a definitive statement about the Hilltop Youth. No one's entirely sure how many there are or even how to define them precisely. Do you count only the ones who have claimed isolated outposts? Do you add in local extremists who live in recognized settlements but spend their time vandalizing Palestinian property? There's no official group called the Hilltop Youth, no clear mission statement or governing body. I feel comfortable saying that anyone who identifies as a Hilltop youth is attracted to a fundamentalist and anti-democratic version of Judaism, and that I think their idealism would probably be better channeled elsewhere. Israel's internal security service, the Shin Bet, sees them differently. Nerd Corner Alert, the Shin Bet or Shabak, is an acronym for Sherut HaBitachon HaKlali, or the General Security Services. Think of them as the internal version of the Mossad, a formidable intelligence and security agency that operates within Israel's borders. We gotta do an episode on them one of these days. Anyway, in August of 2024, the organization's chief warned the government that the movement puts the entire country in danger. In a fiery letter, he wrote, quote, "The damage to the state of Israel is indescribable. Global delegitimization, even among our greatest allies, spreading thin the IDF's personnel, vengeful attacks that are sparking another front in the multi-front war we are in, putting more players into the cycle of terror, a slippery slope to the feeling of a lack of governance, another obstacle to creating local alliances that we need against the Shiite axis, and above all, a massive stain on Judaism and us all." Both the US and the UK have sanctioned extremist settlers who incite and inflict violence against Palestinians, a move that is largely symbolic. The most extreme settler has little interest in their own government's laws, let alone the laws of the UK and the US. For now, the Hilltop Youth and other extremists are a tiny minority among the 500,000 Israelis who live in the West Bank. And several peace groups are working to counter the threat of extremism across Israel and the West Bank, although they don't all agree on an approach. An enigmatic and charismatic and endearing rabbi named Yehuda HaKohen spent the better part of a day with me. We spent time eating sushi in his car driving through the West Bank. It was really warm in his car. It ended up being warm sushi in a warm car driving through Judea and Samaria. Bit of a non sequitur, but trying to paint the picture for you. Anyway, he's an educator, an activist, and this is what he told me.
The best method of resistance we figured out so far to prevent the division of our land and our displacement is to populate as many mountains as we can in the West Bank. I've been part of that. I spent the last 2 decades being part of that, but I've come to the conclusion that it's not enough to populate as many mountains as we can here. We need to actually find partners in Palestinian society and speak in one voice to the world against a two-state solution.
Yep, you heard that right. He's pro-peace, anti-two-state solution. You know why? Say it with me. People contain multitudes.
Vision for the future is a single state between the river and the sea, where we and the Palestinians can live together as partners. We're not going to be some like Western civic national identity. We're not going to be Canadians here together. We're tribal people. They're tribal people. We have to be allies. Okay, that's the key.
And justice in a tribal society can be harsh, or at least unfamiliar to those of us in the Western world.
I think it takes a lot of courage and a lot of self-sacrifice to go, and I'm not saying it's right, but I'm acknowledging that the young Jew who overcomes his own fear and participates in a revenge attack against Hawara or Tumasaya or anywhere else is doing something brave and difficult. They genuinely believe the security forces have let them down. They're coming at it from a perspective of 2 local tribes at war with each other, and they kind of see the army and the state as like referees. And I know, and you probably know, that the state and the army is more often than not on the side of the Jews than the Palestinians in these situations. Ultimately, is if I relate to the state of Israel as the vehicle through which the Jewish people collectively perform the mitzvah of possessing our land, then vigilante actions undermine the state and weaken the state. In many cases, the Palestinians who are being attacked have very little to do with what the Jews are taking revenge for. For example, my wife's cousin was shot in the head a few years ago by the Barghouti family. Okay, not by the Palestinians, by the Barghouti family. If there was a legal framework through which we could take revenge on the Barghouti family, that might interest me. But I don't think it would be helpful to just find some random Palestinian and kill him. Right? But again, a legal framework that's part of the way the state is structured and justice is understood, that those who are harmed can take revenge.
Huwara, by the way, was the site of what the IDF general in charge of the West Bank called a pogrom, though some scoffed at the usage of the term. Check out our episode on Kishinev to learn more about that term. Hundreds of settlers from across the West Bank descended enraged on a Palestinian town in revenge for the murder of two brothers from the town of Har Bracha in the hills of the Shomron. I'm not sure I agree with HaKohen about such revenge attacks being brave. I view it differently, and that's okay to see things differently. It's okay. But I do agree they're deeply tribal, deeply biblical. And in a region that is known for its religious extremism, across the board, maybe that's one path forward. A possibility for what it might look like for two warring people to live side by side. But like all the other visions of coexistence, it requires deep introspection from both sides. Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger is a settler and co-founder of Roots, which brings Jews and Palestinians together. For 30 years, he says, he was living in a bubble, never stopping to wonder how his Palestinian neighbors felt about him.
I began to see that with all the wonder and the glory and the truth and legitimacy of Zionism and of my presence on the land, there was also a dark underbelly to it, and I had no idea. I was blind for over 3 decades. Here in Roots, we talk about a second level of Zionism, a Zionism that serves the Jewish people, but not at the expense of another people, because the Palestinian people exist, they're human beings, they have an identity, they have a connection to the land.
I cannot say this enough. It is my firm belief that until each side acknowledges the other's connection to the land, the other's right to be there, there will be no peace. There will be no Palestinian state. There will be way more Hilltop youth. There will be way more support for Hamas. There will be more sanctions, more extremism, more anger, more grief. Or we could say that people contain multitudes. And we could say that there are multiple narratives that shape the way people think, and they can coexist. As Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger told me.
There could be many truths. It could be a kaleidoscope of truths, and they're all truth. And God, of course, is defined by Kabbalah, by Jewish mysticism, as the kaleidoscope of all the possible truths. And if I want to fulfill the mitzvah, the commandment of walking in God's footsteps, I have to be able to see all those divine truths at the same time and live with them and balance them.
So that's the history of the settlements. And here are your 5 fast facts, or if you want, your multiple ways of viewing it. Number 1. In 1967 Six-Day War, Israel quadrupled its landmass. Soon after, Israelis began to build civilian communities on this newly acquired territory, partially for strategic and security reasons, and partly for historical and religious ones. To most of the world, these communities are known as settlements, and so we use the term settlements throughout. Number 2, according to the UN, the settlements are illegal, though Israel, as well as several scholars of law, disagree with this interpretation. Number 3, in 1979, Israel established the precedent of land for peace, returning the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for a peace treaty that has held ever since. Number 4, in 2000 and 2008, Israel offered a large portion of the West Bank to the Palestinians, while retaining some of its largest settlement blocks in a land swap arrangement. The offers were rejected, and the Israelis continue to build settlements in the West Bank. And number 5, today some 500,000 Israelis and 3 million Palestinians live in the West Bank. They are a diverse crowd with some unexpected opinions, and they live in a kind of limbo, unsure of what the future holds for them. Those are your 5 fast facts. But here's one enduring lesson as I see it. I spent a lot of time in Israel, like a lot. I've spent significant time there, years when I was in yeshiva and when I was in university. I've made a career of studying Israel, of teaching about Israel, of exploring Israel. And still, every time I go, I learn something new about its people. Something that reminds me of a fact that is so easy to forget. We all contain multitudes. It is so easy to make assumptions about people from headlines or polls, to impute a whole life story and outlook and belief system to someone based solely on a demographic checkbox. And it is often so hard to remember that these headlines and checkboxes and statistics are so far from the whole story. Last summer, I took a whirlwind trip to Israel. I met settlers. I met peace activists of all backgrounds. I met people who I expected to dislike but found incredibly charming. And I met people I expected to agree with and really didn't. Sorry. But all of them reminded me of the same thing. We are all complicated. It's okay to be complicated. I'll be upfront with you. As I ate falafel in the settlement of Eli, which has been the site of so much controversy and so much violence from both Israelis and Palestinians, I met people whose opinions confounded me. Many of them flouted the law. Many espoused positions I might describe as extreme. But as we sat there pounding away at some hummus, I found another layer underneath the disagreeable opinions. I found inspiration, whether I agree with them or not. Many of these people love the land in a profound and tactile way. They are deeply connected to it, from the dirt under their fingernails, to the dust embedded in the soles of their sandals. They cultivate it, cherish it, talk about it like a person, like it's a parent endlessly nourishing, like it's a child in need of protection and care, like it's the most precious gift they could imagine. And I, with my suburban house and my suburban lawn and my suburban pool in South Florida, I looked at that love and I felt something unexpected. A mingled sense of connection and awe, maybe also a little bit of jealousy or shame. Because I feel that love too, I do. I feel the love of the Jewish people in my bones. Every day in my work, in my personal life, I carry the legacy of this magnificent gift we have been given, of 4,000 years of history, of this fractured and miraculous land, of this fractious and resilient tribe I am so lucky to be part of. But there is no holy dirt under my fingernails. My Nikes are pristine. I even keep the soles extra white. The love I feel for the land doesn't translate into working it, into physically building it up, into making things grow, and I don't need to agree with their tactics or their opinions or their approach to the law to feel amazed and humbled by the pure and abiding love that many settlers have for this land. By the way, that's the love many Palestinians share. They too feel the connection to their land. They too have ancient dirt under their fingernails and in the treads of their shoes, and many settlers understand that. Many settlers see this love of the land as a point of connection, something they can agree on. And that shared love just might prove the ground where peace can grow. Unpacking Israeli History is a production of Unpacked, a division of Open Door Media. Check out JewishUnpacked.com for everything Unpacked related and subscribe to our other podcasts. And as always, you can find me at Noam@JewishUnpacked.com. It's possible your email might even get on the show. Pretty cool. This episode was produced by Rifki Stern. Our team for this episode includes Esther Baruch, Adi Elbaz, Hansa Perez, and Rob Pera. I'm your host, Noam Weissman. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.